Welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is Jeremy Smith and I'm with GrantStation's online education team. I'll be your host for today's webinar, and that's Navigating Federal Funding Uncertainty. Your presenter for today will be Alice Ruhnke. Let me tell you a little bit about her. She's the president of GrantStation and has raised over $45 million from federal, state, and private grant makers and knows what it takes to get funded. She's a former nonprofit program coordinator and director and founder of the Grant Advantage, and Alice has a really deep understanding of the challenges that nonprofits face. And with that, it's my pleasure to hand it over now to Alice Ruhnke.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Jeremy. And, I think, my bio there of, having that understanding of what nonprofits are facing, that it's really right now is such a challenging time that I'm still kind of there with you. I'm just doing it from a different lens. So what we're going to do today is talk just a little bit, on the background of the funding freeze and kind of what's going on right now, where we're at with a few of those things. But because most of us really kind of know, where we're at with those things, I want to talk a little more about what we can do and look at first how funders have responded, have or have not responded to this moment. And then as this just continues to grow in scope, when we first started, we were worried about executive orders and the funding freeze memo. Well, the issues are really rippling out into the community where more and more and more people are being impacted. Again, I 100% believe that people will be impacted even just at that small scope of, just the nonprofits having the funding freeze, but everything is really escalating. And so again, what's going on with that, and maybe how can we use some of that to advocate more and get our messages out, and kind of just navigating what's going on, right now. What are some things that we can do? I have found that we have been doing an update every month. And some of the things that the very first time that I thought would immediately happen maybe didn't happen. And so, I think that this is something we're always, really needing to keep our eyes on and being willing and able to pivot as we need to. And I do believe as well that that's kind of one of the great things about nonprofits. We are generally built to be pretty fast to move on a dime. And so, what are some other resources that are out there just to help you navigate, and then some personal resources to help you just deal with what's going on right now. And then we will have the time for question and answers. And then, like Jeremy said, because there's such a large group here today, make sure to put it in the Q&A and not the chat, so that we can get to your question. So if you're like me, which I'm sure you are, I'm dizzy right now looking at the landscape. Again, we started with looking at executive orders and what did that mean? And then the funding freeze came out, then the funding memo was rescinded. And then we started to see federal government employees being laid off. After that entire wave, you started seeing the dismantling of different agencies like USAID and the Department of Education. And right now, the Museum and Library Institute, just all of a sudden starting to be, taken apart at its seams. And then, if it's not just that, add the tariffs and what's going on in the economy and the stock market, going down and all those sorts of things. And it's really hard to focus on one thing at a time. And so what I've tried to spend my time focusing on is that funding freeze, so keeping people informed of just that one area. But these things do start to overlap at times, and those kinds of things. But it's really, I'm just being honest, it's so hard right now. But yesterday, I have to admit, I found this on the internet, and this is from Patrick Kirby at Do Good Better Consulting. And this was part of a message that he had sent out of this, market crash, cool, let's do some good. Or still care about people, cool, let's do some good. And this is the kind of thing that I have to keep, as my North Star, and sometimes help me to calm down, to focus on what I can impact, what I can do, making sure that I'm always at least doing what I can do, and that the focus is that people need help. And nonprofits are the people out there helping their communities, doing important good work. And that part doesn't change, right? We are always focused on doing good. And sometimes that can kind of help to take away some of the noise so that, like I said, we can concentrate on those areas that we can make a difference in. What I'm going to start with is just the funding freeze. I do have a blog that I update every week with what's going on. Again, this is strictly related to the funding freeze. And I'm just going to give a really brief background. I know, we all know this, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page, that, this started back in the end of January 27th, where there was a memo that was sent out by the Office of Management and Budget to the agency department heads saying that they had to temporarily pause their grants and loans and financial assistance programs. So that's where this started on that day. From that memo, again, the president wanted every agency to make sure that all of the policies, all of the monies that were being distributed by the federal government adhered to all of his executive orders. And said, that these funds are paused, especially those related to foreign aid, non-government organizations, DEI, woke gender ideology, and the Green New Deal. Right, so those kind of especially were told to pause. So from there, then that's where you start to get the lawsuits, right? And so kind of where we're at with these, and I'm also, tracking other things as well, and I'm kind of seeing this same part of the process. And, again, I'm not a lawyer, so this is all kind of new to me as well, but I'm seeing this same process kind of play out in the field in other cases as well, if it's the dismantling of departments or layoffs and things like that. That was just, something was just announced right before we came on here about those layoffs. So anyway, what these, are is that the plaintiffs then file for an emergency administrative stay. And if they're standing, they can then file for that temporary restraining order. And then again, if there is standing, then it leads to a preliminary injunction. And so with most of these cases, this is where we're at, that all of these things have been filed. They've gone through the process, and we're waiting until they can actually have these court cases for decisions to be made. And so we're in a bit of a holding pattern, waiting on the courts to see these cases and hear these cases, right? So, but with this waiting, there's a few things that we're seeing with the courts, some a little more positive, some maybe a little less positive. So the kind of first the first one was that as these injunctions are set, that then the rulings get appealed and then that goes to another court. And so what we have found so far with the funding freeze is that the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals continued with that injunction and said, yes, again, you cannot continue this freeze. So as it's working its way up the courts are defending the lower courts. Okay, so that's good. However, yesterday, or whenever the fourth was, the Supreme Court did allow for the Trump administration to cancel millions of dollars in education grants that were going out to teachers because they said that they were funding diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so that had gone all the way up to the Supreme Court. So some of these, again, like I said, some of them, you're seeing the assistance to the nonprofit community. Things like this would be less assisted, less help for us as a sector, because those education grants, I'm sure, are very, very important in what they're doing in their communities. So this is kind of what we're waiting on to see how each thing kind of rules out in a court of law. So we're in a holding pattern. What are funders doing as non-governmental funders, right? And so to talk about this, I would also like, as I talk about this, if it's not too disruptive for you, in the chat to say, if you have a local funder that has changed in a positive way to help you out, to provide emergency funding, that sort of thing, can you just put yes in the chat? If you have a local funder that's kind of adapted to what's going on and trying to help, or no, if you just haven't seen any. Because what I'm going to show you here are some of the bigger funders, which is great. There's nothing wrong with these big funders. They make a big difference. But, it's just important to also kind of know what's going on the ground, right? So the Center for Effective Philanthropy wrote a report, or not wrote a report, did a study, and came out with two major kind of conclusions that won't surprise anybody on this call. That the current political climate is negatively affecting their organizations. I would say that a majority of people would say that, and that nonprofit leaders are looking for more communication from their funders, and they're not getting it. So again, that's kind of why in the chat, I'm just trying to see, are we getting, not everything we need, but are your local funders trying to adapt? Because the response from funders has been very, very slow and very varied. Again, when this first happened, I thought it would be as rapid as it was during the pandemic of their response. And this time it hasn't been. And if you follow this link here, you'll see some of the different funders that are increasing how much they're giving out. They're required to give their 5%. They're giving more than their 5%. And so there's a lot of funders doing that. There's a lot of funders who are setting up emergency funds for nonprofits to access, or giving them to different intermediary organizations that are pooling them together that you can then apply for. So that's another kind of positive trend with the funders. Some have completely backed down and taken out all their anything that would be counter to the executive orders, and laying really low and not making any noise that way and just complying with everything. And then others are really stepping up to, again, pour more money into, the areas of DEI or climate, funding, or, anything that's really being challenged right now. So there's a lot of various things that funders are doing. Funders are still funding. We don't want to forget that. The competition is going to go up. So we're really going to have to tighten up our grant applications and things like that. But now is really the time that you do want to be focusing on those private funders and corporate funders and groups like that, local, national, all those sorts of things, to, trying to shore up some of your support. And see if you can get some, again, emergency funds, transitional funds, capacity building funds, any of those kinds of things to help you out in this really, really challenging time. And then I'm going to come back and look at those in the chat, Jeremy, if you, or maybe by the end, if you could kind of tell me oh, there was this percent said no and this percent said yes. So one of the things that I have been doing a lot of is reading about what's going on, watching different webinars from different organizations that are involved with this, and then just looking at what people are doing. And I found this thing from Kentucky, from basically like the Kentucky Nonprofit Association. And they wrote this impact report. I'm going to show you just the highlights, but you can go down here and download it. But it's a really interesting concept, and I think that this could really help, in other places, right? I mean, you could tailor it to your own state, talk to your nonprofit association, but it's really saying, nonprofits impact more than just their own nonprofit or the people that they serve. We have a lot of effects in the community. And the report talks about those effects. So here's just, it's longer than this and has really, neat stuff in it, but I just have 4 major points that they brought out to highlight. Number one, that Kentuckians trust nonprofits, that people do look at nonprofits as the nonpartisan place to go to get that support, to provide services that government either can't or shouldn't provide, right? And so again, looking at your own state and seeing what is that percentage, and then I'm going to talk about messaging all of this in a bit. Critical service delivery. Nonprofits are providing services on the government's behalf with a 66% at financial risk due to the funding pauses. Again, I'm going to give you some resources at the end that's going to talk about what your state risk is based on different criteria that you could look up to see what your, how much of your state nonprofits are reliant on federal funds, and you can find that out on a state-by-state basis to, again, message this. Another one, the effects on employment and the economy, that in Kentucky anyway, 1 in 10 Kentuckians are employed by nonprofits, and they generate 27.4 billion in payroll and expenditures. And so again, this is going to be a significant, if we're cutting the nonprofit, sector, and we're doing all these things at this federal level, it's going to, come down to the state level. It's going to impact people in your state. And this is significant for, a lot of businesses and all those sorts of things. And it's going to make a ripple effect in our communities. And then just kind of, who we are as a sector. That we are very accountable and transparent in all of our work that we do. Our documents, our tax documents are all public documents, right? We are here to, for the public good, to do good, right? And we need that public trust to raise the dollars from donors and those sorts of things. And, we have a lot of rules and regulations that we have to keep up with in order to survive and keep our 501c3 status and things like that. And so again, part of these 4 things are just things that I think are really good messages to be creating for your own communities, to share with both individuals, with people in your community, to educate them more on what's going on. I have to admit, I was rather taken aback when a lot of this started to happen, and I was looking on social media, and then I was hearing people say that, they just give grants to organizations, and I'm like, do you know about the discretionary grant process? Because I'm happy to educate you on that, but they don't give money to anybody without a very rigorous process, right? And I felt really compelled to educate people about that, thinking that, well, people know that already, but they don't. So again, I'm going to show you some resources at the end where you could maybe find this information for your own state and start to kind of message this stuff to both stakeholders and to your government officials. And right now, kind of watching what went on last weekend and the rallies, This is a silver lining for me. This is something that gives me a little more hope um, than maybe I had 2 weeks ago. To see all these people mobilizing all across the country. And so again, it's getting down to everybody's business, right? People are impacted, people are starting to say something. So now maybe people are a little bit more receptive to hearing what we have to say than they were, maybe, in February or in March, right? And so now's a good time to create those messages and tell your story and get out there and take these people who are already energized and continue to mobilize them and bring additional people along. Um, and so this really does give me some really really needed boost in feeling like we're going to make it through this as people get together and work together. I want to talk a little bit about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Um, and diversity, equity, and inclusion is not political. It's not a political topic. It's been politicized, but it's not political. Diversity of ideas, diversity of people, including people in the process. And it's at the core of most of the work that we do, right, in the nonprofit community. And so I think that some of the things that we really have to do is start to talk about it in, we might have to change some words and, that's not what I want to do, but okay, if that's what I have to do. But it's good for business. So start to look at how diversity is good for business in your community, right? And start to get the stories and statistics behind that as well. So that when you're talking to people, you can share this with them. And as we need to continue, we're going to be serving people who are less served. We're the underserved. We're going to be serving people who don't have, the equity isn't there. And so, you will want to work with, different lawyers or different things, looking at your programs and stuff, and you want to stay in compliance obviously with the federal government, but you also can't compromise your core values, right? Like that's who we are. That's the heart of who we are. So really looking at how you're, inclusive in providing services across the spectrum, looking at how you're creating equity where there are disparities. Again, how that is good for your community, if it's economic, if it's social, whatever, and start to pull together whatever you can. I don't think I really have a place to go to pull this information, but a lot of places we're doing a lot of great work around this. And so there probably are resources out there to kind of find how you can quantify this. Again, to keep, this is the heart of what we do. And so we have to figure out how to balance that enough. And so anyway, I really just wanted to bring that up because that's very, very important and something that we're going to have to figure out how to address. Again, it's just critical to who we are as a sector. So the next thing I want to talk about is a little bit more just advocacy in general. This was something that I did talk about at the very first webinar I did for the free webinar. But again, I think that this is, again, a time that maybe the receptiveness of people to listen is a little bit higher. People have been calling, their senators and their representatives. My husband calls them every single solitary day. Not a lie. But right now, more and more people are calling, right? Again, you see the people on the streets. You're seeing people impacted economically or in different ways, or their retirement accounts being, dissolved and things like that. And so your people are really starting to feel it. The margins are very slim. And so there might be people who at this point that might be able to pivot enough to actually make a difference in the Senate and in Congress. So I've kind of picked back up in my calling as well. I don't do it every single day, but I've gotten back into doing this. And so again, if you haven't done this, or you haven't mobilized your stakeholders to do this, or your volunteers, or the people you serve, or your board members, this would be a good thing to do, to find out who your representatives are. Also look at different committee assignments that, they're like the Appropriations Committee, look at the Health Committee, the Education Committee in the Senate, in the House, those kinds of things, and find out who those folks are, and talk to them, call them to talk. And I have just some kind of best kind of practices in how we're going to do that, right? So the best options are those local events. Whenever they come back into town, they have town halls. I know they're starting to cancel those because, again, people are coming and people are sharing their displeasure. So if the town halls start to get canceled because of that, then I think we're going to have to just keep calling, just keep calling. You can call, you can make 7 or 6 calls a day if you want, right? Where you can call the DC office of your senator and the local office of your senator, your 2 senators, and then your local representative, their DC office and their local office. And as you call them, some things to really craft in your message, who you are, your nonprofit, who you serve, what you do. Really showing how the funding freeze, or if it's, it can be other components, the layoffs or the dismantling of departments, any of these things, but how they're affecting your organizations and the communities that you support. Using as much data as you can with that. Again, I'm going to show you some different impact reports that you can go to start to pull some of that local information, or at least statewide information, for yourself. And then I think that, again, as nonprofits, one of our greatest assets is that we have the people that we serve, and we can help tell their stories or have them tell their stories, which is always very, very, very powerful to add to any data. Then what's that specific thing that you're asking them to do? I'm asking you to, restore the funding to this program. I'm asking you to, stand up against this. I'm asking you to not pass this budget, whatever it is that, you're calling about. And then just kind of, thank you, follow up with them, and that sort of thing. So when I've talked to different people who do advocacy work as, the main work that they do, and this is also just something that I've always talked about when you're talking to funders, even though we're talking about talking to political folks, but make sure when you're out there talking to people that you're really talking about how the lack of your service, or the not being funded, impacts your community, impacts those you serve, more than saying, I need, I had to fire my program coordinator because of this, and I really need that program coordinator, right? That maybe has happened, right? But talk more about the impact of the people who aren't being served now because there's no program coordinator, right? And so, talking more about what that impact is, than talking about your needs as an organization, right? Not that you can't, but just put focus heavier on your solutions that you provide in the community. Just a couple other best practices in calling and stuff. When you're calling the DC office, they usually have a staffer kind of for different areas. So, you could call if you were in healthcare or education or climate, you can call and say, can I speak with the staffer in charge of that? They might not be available, they might be busy, but if you can get a hold of that person, that they're just always there taking that information in their particular topic. And local offices, they might have them, but they won't always have, those specific staff members. And then, just kind of keep talking. Uh, if you get transferred to somebody that you didn't want to necessarily talk to, just keep talking. Keep telling that person your story, right? Most of these groups, they get together at the end of, a business day or maybe a couple of business days, and they do talk about what those calls are about. And what's coming into that senator or congressperson's office. And so just keep talking. Don't feel like you're bugging them. That you're supposed to be bugging them right now. That's part of the process, the democratic process. Um, when a lot of times when I calls, they'll either ask for my zip code or if not, I've gotten into the habit of telling them my zip code, just because that also kind of helps that that they really know that you are one of their constituents in their communities. And then, and then extra points, if your zip code also, like let's say your zip code always votes for that person, or voted, them into office, or that kind of thing, like, letting them know that you're in that zip code and you care and you're calling and you're telling them what you think. Um, just a couple of other things, if you can make it personal, you can make it personal, I voted for you. Or, maybe not, maybe you didn't vote for him, but I'm a small business owner in your community who really cares about, children's health. And so I'm calling about this because I'm worried and being very specific. And then, it is kind of hard with all that's going on to pick one or two things to talk about because it all just seems bonkers at times when you try to look at everything. So, kind of focus in on just, maybe one day this topic, another day this topic, and really focus in on specific things that you can say what you're asking for specifically. What are you asking them to do? What's the call to action that you're asking from them? Um, and then I think I've kind of always said this. Yeah, I think I really said this, but be clear on what you want. What do you want them to do? There's also nothing wrong with calling up your senators that are all, that are out there supporting what you want. And just thanking them. I'm sure it's very hard to be out there right now. And so just even calling to give your positive support can be really helpful for those that are out there doing that work day in and day out. So that's also something that the flip side of the positiveness can just help keep the momentum moving forward. And then, yeah, I always, was worried like, oh my gosh, like with my husband, I'm like, you call every day. I'm like, do they know it's you? And he was like, well, yeah, I give them my name every day. I'm like, oh my gosh, they probably really don't want to talk to you every day, but they do. So pretty interesting. And they'll take his call every single day. Um, so we have some of that. We have that advocacy. Again, if we start to mobilize some of those folks that are now get more engaged in the process, we can get them calling some of those, government reps, getting those people out there. There's also different just groups that are, really pulling together great stories, really doing a lot of important work out there. So a big one's the National Council of Nonprofits. You guys have probably heard of them. They're the plaintiffs in one of the plaintiffs in the case on the funding freeze. And I'm going to point you to a bunch of their resources. They're updating their resources very frequently. And I go to them a lot. They have a frequently asked questions that helps me answer questions that are in my head, has lots of resources. I'll point you to that. Then also check with your state nonprofit association. Again, that Kentucky thing that I showed you was from a Kentucky nonprofit association. So check with your nonprofit association, see what they're doing, see how you can help, see how you can join, see how the storytelling, that they're pulling stories together. What can we do with these stories? How can we get this messaging out? Connecting with your other grantees, I think, is also a great idea. If you're, funded through a federal program, call your other grantees, even if your funding has been frozen. Talk to them about what they're doing and what strategies they're putting together, and how they're coping, and those kinds of things. Or even doing it more on a local level, where if you have a local private funder, have them connect with the other grantees to see how folks are doing. Then other just partnerships that you may have, or coalitions in your community. Again, there's strength in numbers. And so the more we can connect, the better. And then just with general community education, writing op-eds, calling the press, reaching out to journalists, telling them the story of what's happening and how your community is impacted, and all those sorts of things. Really important things to do to get that message out, that people just might not be aware of what that impact is on your local community, and the local journalists can help tell that story. Here's some of the resources that I want, and when I'm just going to have Jeremy send the actual slides, because I linked all of these within it. So it'd just be easier if I send the slides than a PDF. So we'll send those out after. But we have, this is from the National Council of Nonprofits, and so they have updated the executive orders. They had them kind of originally when, January into February, but now they've updated it with additional ones and a better tracking thing. So you can track what's going on, where the lawsuits are, what stage they're in, and all that sort of thing with the different executive orders. Then their FAQs is really great. Like I said, I get a lot of answers to my personal questions answered there by reading that. And then the impact map is by the impact project, and that's where you're going to see that data on how your state, how much of your state nonprofits are funded by federal grants, and how it could be impacted, or what the economic impact is of the nonprofit community on your in your community. And then there's also places that you can submit information to this map to make it a more robust map for people to really see the scope of how this is impacting the entire country everywhere. We're also going to have a Target Ed series on kind of shifting our perspectives. How do we move forward with our grant writing when we're looking at those, like just for example, those DEI things, and we might have to shift language. How do we do that and stay true to ourselves? So how do we shift to going from being kind of socially based, and we provide good services and we do a social good in the community, to how do we shift to talking about having that economic impact in the community? How do we shift to a more strength-based process? How do we design programs that are more scalable? Those kinds of things. So our first one is going to be free, and you can come and just listen and see if this is a series that you want to take. You can take them individually if you'd like. You can take the whole series if you'd like. But you can come to the free one and kind of see what we're looking at as to how to reset the priorities in line more with what funders, federal and a lot of government, a lot of private funders are asking for. And then I have kind of as a wrap up here, just a really great toolkit that I saw. And you can just click on this and go to this toolkit. But I really thought it was very important. They were talking, this particular blog is talking about how you cope, but in a previous blog, they talked about how this uncertainty that we're going through, that it can really rewire our brains with chronic stress and overload. And how are we, able to stop that or prevent that? And how can you unwire that once you get that really chronic stress buildup? And so those were some of the things they talked about at first, but then they give you lots of great coping mechanisms about the 3 steps. And this I also found very interesting. Is I've talked a lot about restore. How do you self-care? How do you do those kinds of things? without talking about that regulate component of how do we regulate to get our systems back into this calm place so that we can restore. Because if we're come into the restore space and we're not regulated and we're still full of overwired stimulation, we're not going to be able to restore. And so, and then ways to reframe, kind of like you're seeing there with Patrick's thing that helps me reframe things a bit in my own head and keeps me moving forward. And it has lots of options for all of them. Like, how can you regulate? How can you restore? How can you reframe? And you can find different ways that match your style, and to just help yourself continue to cope through all of these changes and uncertainty, which is challenging. So with all of that, I think we will go ahead, and I see we have some questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to take a quick drink and then we'll see what kinds of questions we have.
That sounds great. I want to thank everybody for being with us today. Quick reminder, you'll get a copy of the recording as well as the slides, which have all the links on them. So then you'll be able to click them and find everything we've talked about today. Also, I'll include a copy of the slides, the chat as well. That'll have all the links in there. And one thing that's been coming up a lot in chat is about Lillian. People are interested in her policies, and she just put her email address in there. If you're interested in finding out more about those policies she's been talking about in the chat. A lot of people seemed interested, so I just wanted to call that out directly. So thank you for offering that, Lillian. And with that, let's do some questions. So Crystal asks, I'm wondering what your opinion is regarding grant proposals that were submitted prior to the DEI executive order. Will they be thrown out?
Crystal, I honestly don't have an answer to that question, and so I don't want to give an incorrect answer. My assumption would be that it would be reviewed for all the DEI language, and that it probably would not be funded because there's probably DEI language in there. That is one of the questions. You might want to go to the National Council of Nonprofits FAQs because they might have some guidance there. But I don't know it. But just knowing that like currently awarded grants, if you had it, they were throwing out those parts as well. My assumption would be that they would either come back and say, we're not funding it, or they're going to come back and say, if you change all of these things. But I really highly doubt that they're going to go through. But that's just Alice Ruhnke talking, not anybody who knows that answer.
What's that disclaimer? It's like, I'm not a lawyer, therefore, this is not
Right.
lawyer-like advice.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so let's do another one. This is kind of a big one, and I
Okay.
think we're ready for it. This one's from Mary. What are your thoughts, or especially opinions, on the dismantling of the Department of Education? She's anxious to apply for Department of Ed funding that's typically announced in the spring, Title III and FSCS specifically.
Yeah. So again, don't really know anything, but I do I think that they are talking about with the Department of Ed in moving a lot of the funding over to other agencies and still being administered through other agencies. I don't know about I have seen some things of will TRIO programs be awarded because they're entirely for, students who are underserved. Will they come out again, as a funding opportunity? And so I don't have the answer to that, but from the things being said right now, they are saying that it wouldn't be through the Department of Education, but some of those funding opportunities would still be available. So hopefully, yes, but I don't know the answer to that one either. I probably don't know the answer to any of these.
Well,
I hate to give out answers when I don't know the answer. So, just want to be honest about that.
well, also like we're all saying, I mean, no one really knows what's going to happen.
Yes.
Each day
Yeah.
is a
Yes.
fresh new adventure is the best way to look at it.
Absolutely.
So here's one that maybe this might be more up our alley. Svetlana has had a problem that was asked earlier by Crystal, and this is just a really sort of boiled down version. They use the word diversity 5 times in an NEA grant. They're supposed to hear about it this month, but they have no idea. Do you
Right.
think this is like, do you think grants with that type of language will probably be denied?
I mean, I know that we are going to have to change our language, kind of moving forward. If there's words that are going to automatically kick your grant out of consideration, then we're going to have to change our words. And I mean, that's very silly, and I don't like that. But if that's what we have to do to get the money to provide the services that we provide, we can learn how to change those words. Um, so, but I don't know, again, with things that have already been submitted, again, I have a feeling that, um, you know, that probably that will be a problem. Because it's a problem with already awarded grants. So if they haven't even been awarded yet, I could see where they just wouldn't fund them. I know that a lot of agencies also, have had so much federal upheaval that this might not be possible. But if you look at those federal grants that you're applying for or wanting to apply for or did apply for, see if you can call any of those. Usually there's the 2 or 3 people in the back of the RFP that are the program people or whatever, the finance person usually. See if you can get a hold of them as well. See if they can, provide any direction for you. I know that doesn't always work, but I think it's worth a try, to just help you, try to figure out um, what you can, what options you have.
This question is from Helen. I wonder if you have any advice for how to talk to donors who are responding in a less than polite way to outreach, as they may be getting more and more requests,
Mhm.
probably some frantic requests too, because of what's happening at the federal level. Especially when they've been loyal, you have a history with them, and just wondering any advice for how to talk to donors in that situation. That sort of
Yeah.
heightened, they don't have their chakras aren't aligned, as you were talking about.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think that yes, it is going to be harder to even fundraise at a, fundraising level, because everybody in your community is going through this. And if there's people who traditionally donate, they're being asked to donate more to their causes that they already support, being asked to donate to causes that, that resonate with them. So I think it's kind of, going back, to those relationships. They are super important if they're donors that you rarely have talked to in the past year, and you come around once a year and ask for money. You haven't probably built as good enough of a relationship with them to help you through these hard times. If you're only kind of treating those donors as, once a year, give me money kind of transactional, kind of way. So I think that it's about developing, and we're right in the moment of it, but developing those strategies of closer connections and then appealing as much as you can, again, not to your organization, but to the cause. Because if they're giving to your organization, they obviously care about the cause. So connecting with them on that level and maintaining that connection throughout the year and making your donor base a relational situation and not a transactional situation.
Here's an
That's
interesting
what
one
I would
from
answer.
here's an interesting one from Susan, which I think is a good follow-up for that. Do you think that language needs to be rethunk for non-government funders as well? Especially because we're wondering if, if one person's doing it and it's, the US government, do we
Right,
think that everyone's going to follow, even if they're not government based?
right. I think that, I think that in a lot of cases, your local funders, may very well be keeping their DEI initiatives, keeping their woke ideology, as it's written in the executive order, and they're not changing. And so, I mean, definitely at the federal level, yes, we are going to have to change the language. We're going to have to do that. Um, but your local funders, that doesn't mean that you have to change at that level. So again, I think it is, talking to other grantees that get funding from that funder, talking to that funder, asking them, if they're changing with any of this. But in all reality, we don't have to change for private funders or corporate funders that haven't changed. So this is, really a government issue. And unless the funders are following suit, which some are, but if they're not following suit, you can do as you used to.
This one I don't know if there is really an answer for, but I think it's an interesting topic to bring up from Alexandria. Um, they can pivot with DEI by changing the language and eliminating terminology that administration finds offensive. But a serious concern, though, about funding for arts and cultural activities. She received an email that was sent out from the West Virginia, I'm assuming, Humanities Council, and they're basically terminated immediately due to their loss of federal funding. According to the administration, arts and culture, nonprofits, museums, and libraries will no longer be integrated into strategies, policies, and programs that advance the economic development, well-being, and resilience of all communities. Um, I'm just
And
wondering, what's your take on that?
it's baffling. I mean, um, it it is actually so contrary to the truth, because arts and culture do have a lot of economic impact on our communities. I'm from West Virginia, actually, um, so this doesn't surprise me, unfortunately. But it, it's really hard to try to understand what that logic is when we know that arts and culture do have an economic and community impact. And if people are just saying it doesn't, I honestly don't know where to go with that either, because it's, can you collect that data that says what that economic, can you go, kind of like the way tourism has things, is there information that the Humanities Council has pulled together over the years that talk about, the benefits to West Virginia and the community because of the arts? I'm sure that they have data to prove it. So if it's just messaging going out to newspapers with information on this. This is what was said, but this is the truth. This is what we have data to support that this is not accurate. It's just trying to dismantle those myths that are being put out there. And I'm not saying that's easy, but again, if we can get more and more people to do it, more people educated about what's going on, more people talking about it, as an entire group, maybe we can make a difference.
And I know it's a tough one, so I thought it was good to
Yeah,
talk about though. So
yeah,
CJ's in a very unique situation. Um, all their Fed reps are quite blue,
yeah.
so they can call and thank them, and they do often that you mentioned earlier. But how can they impact those elsewhere in the major party? And this is, we were just talking about that, as you said, getting this groundswell support that's there now. Let's tap into
Right.
that. What other ideas do you have for someone who's already in at least a politically good situation for their funding needs?
Yep. I think that some of the things I'm trying to think of what, because if you called to, I'm just gonna say a red state, called to West Virginia, right? That would be a red state. Would they listen to you? You're not from the state. You can't give your zip code. What does that really kind of matter? So I think that I would call your Fed reps, and talk to them and kind of say, where would be places and people that we could reach out to that you think would make a difference, to have that communication with? So maybe it's like somebody on, like I said, like the appropriations committee or the healthcare committee or education committee or whatever, and maybe contacting people even though you don't live in their state, but you have an interest, you're a stakeholder in education, you're a stakeholder in health, you're a stakeholder in these things as a US citizen. And maybe, they could tell you those to kind of target, because they would know more what's going on like behind the scenes, and who is maybe in different areas where votes are a little more fluid, that having more noise would help sway things one way or the other. So, and I think just asking your people who to contact, that would give you a good way to kind of develop a strategy.
There's been some really great information in the chats. I'm trying to read the chats, listen to
Yeah.
Alice, make sure the question and answer is good. So if we do miss something, we apologize. It's just we're not able to handle it all. But quick note, you'll be getting a copy of everything that you've seen and heard, as well as a copy of the slides, and we'll include all the information to you. But I do want to do one more question I think we can fit in to round up
Okay.
today. This one's from Laura, which is very handy, blending all this together. Thank you, Laura. That's very clever of you to put it that way. How do you build a non-transactional relationship with funders while also advocating for them not to change their values based on what the federal government says is a priority or not?
Well, that is a good question. I think that, having those relationships with funders, they, I think you have to do it with information, with data and stories, right? But you have to show, what, instead of just saying DEI is illegal, it's not. It's not political, and so, talking with them about what's going on and what the impact is on the community. I mean, usually, let me start over again. So funders, will usually have areas that they want to fund and they want to make a difference in, right? That's part of their mission. So again, if it's healthcare or the homeless or, whatever, education, youth, whatever. And so I think that connecting on that topic, and how you have solutions to helping that topic that furthers their mission, and that you're in partnership with them, and that you know that there isn't a good logical reason to say, that you don't have an impact. Show them your impact. Tell them your impact. We get this many kids to graduate from high school. We get, has an economic impact. We get people off the streets, which has this economic impact, and so just talking about the issue and how you have solutions that you provide, that's a benefit to them. And, maybe you don't have to talk about any of the federal stuff with that. That's the core. That's what you're doing. That's what you're trying to make a difference in. That's your mission. And usually it aligns with the funder's mission, that's what they want to change too. So, going into it as a partner without, with only talking about the solutions and maybe not even talking about this stuff. Or if you're going to talk about it, show how what that impact is. That, again, you probably have to do a little research, but we know DEI is good for business. We know it's good for community. We know it's good for whatever. So how do we then, tell that story to them?
Visit GrantStation to see our latest online education offerings in the form of live webinars, interactive workshops, and on-demand learning. GrantStation.com.